In the complex arena of global diplomacy and economics, the loudest voices often seem to dominate the headlines. But it is the quiet players, the ones who act with purpose, patience, and precision, that ultimately command the greatest respect. India's response to diplomatic provocation by Turkey and Burkina Faso exemplifies this quiet power. When these nations publicly opposed India's position on sensitive matters and took stances that disrespected its sovereignty, India did not retaliate through aggressive rhetoric or public campaigns. Instead, it chose the path of silent strength. This approach, though less dramatic, carried far more weight. It demonstrated that influence in today's world is not necessarily about how loud a nation can be, but about how effective and strategic its silence can become. This form of disengagement is incredibly powerful in a globalized world. The world today runs on interdependence. Economies rely on trade, tourism, labor, and technology partnerships. When a country like India, with its massive domestic market, skilled human capital, and growing international reputation, starts to pull away, the ripple effects are not immediate, but they are unmistakable. Hotels in Turkey started reporting lower bookings. Exporters began facing difficulties as Indian demand softened. In Burkina Faso, agricultural, energy, and educational collaborations with Indian enterprises slowed down or ceased altogether. The result wasn't chaos, it was quiet damage, the kind that becomes obvious only after it's already done. India's method of response is rooted in its civilizational values and modern confidence. Historically, India has avoided aggression unless provoked severely. But its approach is never weak, is strategic. When insulted, it doesn't shout, it recalibrates. That recalibration might involve redirection of resources, reshuffling of priorities, and in this case, economic detachment. In the short term, such detachment doesn't make headlines, but in the long term, it creates undeniable shifts in perception and behavior. Turkey and Burkina Faso, after experiencing the impact of India's absence, realized that they had miscalculated. They had mistaken India's silence for indifference when, in fact, it was a deliberate message. We do not need to protest loudly to make our presence or our absence felt. Silent strength is not about ignoring challenges or pretending everything is fine. It is about choosing the most effective form of response. In business, when a partner disrespects you, walking away from the table without drama shows you value your principles over profits. The same logic applies to nations. India's refusal to engage in public spats did not signify weakness. It signaled maturity. It said, "We know our worth. If you don't, we will move on." This message resonated far beyond Ankara or Algado. Other countries, observing India's restraint and the consequences faced by those who disrespected it, took note. They saw that India could not be bullied or taken for granted, and that its partnerships were based on mutual respect, not pressure. This strategy also aligns with how India is positioning itself on the global stage. As a rising economic superpower, India is not only investing abroad, but also becoming a key market for others. Its talent pool, digital infrastructure, and consumer base are valuable to countries looking for growth. Walking away from such a partner is never a light decision. The silent response India adopted forced others to confront this reality without being publicly shamed. It wasn't about revenge, it was about self-respect. And eventually, that self-respect led Turkey and Burkina Faso to reconsider their positions. They began re-engaging diplomatically. They extended invitations. They showed a willingness to re-establish what had been quietly lost. What makes silent strength so effective is that it leaves room for the other side to reflect and return. A loud confrontation can escalate. A quiet withdrawal creates space for realization. Turkey, now seeking to re-strengthen ties with India, has modified its public statements. Burkina Faso is asking for the revival of partnerships and projects that were once put on hold. They understand now what India represents not just as a nation, but as a global partner. Silent strength in international affairs is not passive. It is deeply active and intentional. It's a strategy that values long-term gains over short-term reactions. But when Turkey began making bold and controversial geopolitical statements that undermined India's sovereignty, particularly around sensitive issues like Kashmir, It violated that foundation of trust. Burkina Faso, following suit, made similar political alignments that positioned it in opposition to India's interests on international platforms. While these nations may have believed they were asserting their independence or aligning with more influential powers, they severely underestimated how deeply intertwined their progress had become with India's support and cooperation. When India began to pull back, the effects were not instantly visible, but they were inevitable. Turkish tourism, which had enjoyed a significant influx from Indian travelers, began to slow. Indian companies began to pause or redirect investments elsewhere. Educational exchanges, joint ventures, and even medical tourism saw a noticeable decline. In Burkina Faso, Indian-backed developmental projects slowed down. Access to affordable medicine, agricultural equipment, and water purification systems, many of which were supplied through Indian initiatives, became inconsistent or expensive. The loss here wasn't just economic, it was strategic. These countries had not just lost a trading partner. They had lost a nation that was investing in their future without imposing dominance. India's partnerships are rooted in inclusion, skill sharing, and upliftment, not exploitation. When such a partner withdraws, it's not just the present that suffers, it's the potential of the future that gets stalled. What made the situation worse for Turkey and Burkina Faso was that other countries were watching. In today's interconnected world, reputation is everything. Nations began to notice how India responded, not with fury, but with focus. It quietly shifted attention to nations that respected its principles and saw its value. Trade deals with Southeast Asia and Africa expanded diplomatic relations with countries like Egypt, Kenya, and Indonesia were deepened. India's message was simple but profound. If you value us, we will build with you. If you don't, we won't argue. We'll just walk away. This shift exposed a vital truth. When you lose India as a partner, you lose more than revenue. You lose credibility. You lose an ally who believes in long-term development, who brings technical expertise, who understands the needs of developing nations, and who can stand by you, not just with money, but with knowledge and people. No Western power provides what India provides. In the same way, India is not just a funder, it is a builder. Losing that kind of partner puts any nation at a disadvantage. What makes trust so important in global partnerships is that it multiplies over time. One trustworthy act leads to another, and soon a web of cooperation is formed that benefits both sides exponentially. But once trust is broken, the loss is not linear. It is exponential as well. A lost partner like India doesn't just remove their resources. Their absence disrupts the ecosystem. They help build. Factories slow down. Jobs disappear. Student exchanges drop. Research projects go unfulfilled. And sectors that were thriving begin to wither. Turkey and Burkina Faso are now working to rebuild that trust. But it won't be easy. Trust once broken is far harder to restore than it is to earn. And this is why underestimating a trusted partner like India was a mistake. Not because India sought revenge, but because India offered real value. And when real value disappears, the gap it leaves cannot be filled by rhetoric or replacement. Global partnerships today are not based on who speaks the loudest or who has the most powerful allies. They are based on credibility, consistency, and the ability to deliver value without conditions. India has built its reputation by being consistent in its approach, respectful in its partnerships, and reliable in its commitments. When a nation disrespects that, it signals to others that it does not value long-term success. And in a world that is moving faster than ever, no country can afford to lose valuable, reliable partners who are deeply invested in their growth. Turkey and Burkina Faso didn't just misjudge India's reaction. They misjudged their own capacity to replace the trust, respect, and impact that India brought to the table. They are now experiencing the reality that losing a partner like India is not just a foreign policy mistake. It's a strategic failure. Today, we stand at the crossroads of global economics, diplomacy, and the shifting tides of influence in a world that's no longer controlled by a few. This is the era of new powers rising, and India, with its unstoppable momentum, is at the very heart of this transformation. In the fast-changing landscape of global relations, respect has become the true currency that holds partnerships together. Unlike the past, where power was displayed through force or wealth alone, today's global order is shaped by how nations treat one another with dignity, fairness, and acknowledgement of mutual interest. India's relationship with countries like Turkey and Burkina Faso is a prime example of how the presence or absence of respect can determine the direction of economic and diplomatic outcomes. India did not isolate these countries out of vengeance. It simply responded to disrespect by withdrawing quietly and firmly. The result was not immediate noise, but long-term loss for those who failed to grasp the importance of mutual respect. When Turkey took a politically aggressive stand against India by supporting Pakistan's position on Kashmir and making inflammatory statements in international forums, it stepped beyond the bounds of healthy diplomacy. Likewise, Burkina Faso followed suit, aligning with positions that openly challenged India's sovereignty. These nations may have believed that their comments would either go unnoticed or curry favor with other global players. But what they failed to understand was that India, despite not engaging in loud retaliation, registers such actions deeply rather than react emotionally. It chooses a measured path. That path involves distancing itself from partners who do not value mutual respect. India's approach to global relations is deeply rooted in its civilizational ethos. It believes in building, not breaking. It favors cooperation over conflict, and it values dignity as a non-negotiable principle, whether through initiatives like the Indian Technical and Economic Cooperation IT Strike Program or through soft power tools like yoga, cinema, and education. India has positioned itself as a collaborator. It doesn't come into relationships with the intention of domination. It comes with a desire to grow together. But the moment that spirit is violated, India does not cling to damaged ties. It steps back not to punish but to protect its values. Respect is also the cornerstone of how India conducts economic partnerships. When it helps build roads in Africa, provides low-cost medicines to remote nations, or sets up digital infrastructure in emerging markets, it does so not with the colonial mindset, but with an approach rooted in empowerment. There are no hidden conditions, no debt traps, and no attempts to control domestic policy. India respects the sovereignty of its partners, but it expects the same in return. When nations like Turkey and Burkina Faso dismiss that understanding, they are not just making a political statement, they are breaking the unwritten contract of mutual dignity. The impact of losing India's respect is not easily repaired. Other countries may have the resources to step in temporarily, but few have the depth of trust and shared history that India brings to the table. Nations that disrespect India lose not just current engagement, but the goodwill required for future cooperation. They miss out on one of the few global powers that treats its partners as equals, not subordinates. And as these countries later realize, re-earning that respect is much harder than losing it. Turkey, after realizing the consequences of its actions, began shifting its tone. It initiated renewed diplomatic efforts, opened up to re-engagement in trade and culture, and began taking a more neutral stance in forums where earlier it had taken sides. Burkina Faso, seeing the vacuum left behind by India's withdrawal, expressed renewed interest in development aid and infrastructure collaboration. These shifts were not born out of fear. They came from recognition that a relationship with India is not based on pressure. It is based on mutual benefit, and that benefit cannot exist without respect at its core. The world today is not short of opportunities, but the most meaningful opportunities come from relationships that are stable, respectful, and balanced. India brings that equation into every partnership it forms. It doesn't threaten or demand. It doesn't enforce or impose. It builds, delivers, and supports. But in return, it expects to be treated with fairness. That expectation is not arrogance. It is the minimum requirement for cooperation in any domain, diplomatic, economic, cultural, or educational. In this era where nations are interlinked more than ever before, the importance of respect is even more amplified. This respect doesn't just strain a political relationship. It disrupts supply chains, weakens trade, delays infrastructure, and reduces educational exchange. And respect doesn't require countries to agree on everything. It only asks for acknowledgement of each other's importance, sovereignty, and unique path. When that is upheld, partnerships flourish. When it is broken, cooperation fades. In the modern global order, influence is no longer measured solely by military might or diplomatic pressure. Influence has evolved into something far more subtle, yet far more powerful. It is no longer what a country says about itself, but what others feel in its absence. India, a country that once was overlooked in global decision-making, is now redefining what global influence truly means. Its actions or inaction carry weight. The story of Turkey and Burkina Faso illustrates this concept clearly. These nations, having taken positions that undermined India's core interest, witnessed the impact not through sanctions or retaliation, but through silence. Yet this silence was not passive. It was filled with consequence. When India chose to step back, it didn't need to justify its reasons or announce its decisions. The absence of India's involvement, investment, and engagement was enough to trigger a chain reaction. The tourism industry in Turkey began to feel the lack of Indian travelers who had increasingly chosen Turkey as a destination in the past. Indian businesses known for setting up collaborative ventures and tech-based operations either slowed down or completely froze their plans. Importers and exporters lost access to a large and stable trade partner. These were not protests. These were not boycotts with placards. These were quiet decisions made in boardrooms, consulates, and company headquarters. Decisions that echoed across economies. Burkina Faso, a developing nation heavily reliant on international partnerships for health, education, and infrastructure development, similarly underestimated the depth of India's influence. Indian pharmaceutical companies, agricultural consultants, and tech-based educational programs were playing a key role in the country's development. But when Burkina Faso aligned itself politically against India, it failed to realize that such actions would trigger the quiet withdrawal of one of its most beneficial partners. What was lost wasn't just money, it was momentum. Hospitals faced delays in medicine supply. Rural areas lost access to new water technologies. The sense of progress that came with Indian cooperation started to erode. This form of influence, where the absence of a country causes more disruption than its presence, is a rare and unique strength. It means that the country has embedded itself deeply into the economic and social fabric of its partners, and India has done exactly that through decades of low-cost innovation, people-centric investment, and culturally sensitive engagement. Unlike countries that use dominance or debt traps to control influence, India uses credibility. It builds relationships through educational scholarships, trade fairness, skilled migration, and technology transfer. When it leaves, it doesn't just take away goods or people. It takes away trust and sustainability. In the case of Turkey, which has long positioned itself as a bridge between the East and West, losing the goodwill of India was a reputational blow. Turkey's actions on international forums, including its strong statements against India's internal matters, were not received well. Instead of responding with aggressive diplomacy, India simply shifted focus. More Indian tourists started choosing the UAE, Egypt, and even Eastern Europe. Indian businesses opened new dialogues with Greece and other Mediterranean nations. Turkey's realization came not when India responded, but when India stopped responding. The silence was powerful. It forced Turkey to reflect, not because they were threatened, but because they began to feel the vacuum. In geopolitics, most countries try to exert influence by pushing by, applying pressure, lobbying, or imposing conditions. But India's strategy is different. It pulls, it attracts. Its influence is magnetic, not coercive. And that is why it is so deeply felt when it is withdrawn, because India brings along not just capital or contracts, but culture, human talent, education, and grassroots solutions. Its absence creates not just a diplomatic void, but a developmental one. Governments start to feel the missing technical expertise, the slowed-down capacity building, and the lack of scalable innovation. This influence is also magnified by India's massive diaspora, which contributes to the global economy and connects India with the world in ways that traditional diplomacy cannot. When India moves away, its people, its companies, and its ideas also drift, and this collective absence makes nations like Turkey and Burkina Faso reconsider their choices. They realize that influence is not about domination. It's about presence, and when India is not present, the gap is hard to fill. Influence today is also about consistency and reliability. Many nations promise aid or partnerships, but few deliver without strings attached. India has built its image as a reliable partner, one that delivers solutions rather than problems. Whether it's sending vaccines during a pandemic, training professionals in IT and healthcare, or providing low-cost sustainable technologies, India's contributions have earned trust globally. When a nation loses access to that reliability, the loss is not abstract. It's operational. Systems break down, programs stall, and development targets fall behind. India's influence is also rooted in mutual respect. It does not seek to overpower. It seeks to uplift. That is why its silent retreat is so significant. It sends a quiet but clear message. Relationships must be based on mutual dignity. If that is broken, India will not fight, but it will leave. And when it leaves, the difference is not just seen. It is deeply felt.